Hello, friends. This evening, we'll be exploring why you wouldn't last a day in feudal Japan. So let's not waste any time and begin our tale. Imagine stepping off a time machine into the dusty streets of medieval Japan, where the year might be 1185 or perhaps 1467. And the first thing that hits you isn't the exotic beauty you might have expected from movies or books, but the overwhelming stench of human waste, rotting fish, and unwashed bodies that seems to hang in the air like an invisible fog that follows you everywhere you go. The romantic notion of feudal Japan that popular culture has painted in your mind would shatter within moments of your arrival, because the reality of life during this period was harsh, unforgiving, and utterly alien to everything you know about modern existence, where even the poorest among us live like kings compared to the average peasant who scraped by in those distant centuries. Your first challenge wouldn't be understanding the language, though that would certainly pose problems since the Japanese spoken then was quite different from modern Japanese, filled with archaic terms and complex honorific systems that could literally mean the difference between life and death if you got them wrong when addressing someone of higher social status. No, your first real challenge would be something far more basic and immediate: the simple act of relieving yourself. In feudal Japan, there were no private bathrooms as we understand them today, no toilet paper, no running water, and certainly no sewage systems that whisked away waste to treatment plants miles from where people lived and worked. Instead, you would find yourself confronting the reality of communal latrines that were nothing more than wooden structures built over pits, where dozens of people would squat side by side, with no privacy whatsoever, while the accumulated waste below fermented in the heat and attracted clouds of flies that would swarm around your exposed skin. The smell alone would be enough to make most modern people violently ill, but that's just the beginning of your bathroom-related troubles, because the Japanese of this era used small wooden sticks, or if they were lucky, scraps of rough paper to clean themselves. And the concept of washing your hands afterward with soap was completely foreign, since soap as we know it didn't exist in feudal Japan. But let's say you somehow managed to overcome your revulsion and adapt to these primitive sanitary conditions, because there are far greater challenges waiting for you in this strange new world, where your very survival depends on understanding and navigating a social hierarchy so rigid and complex that making a single mistake could result in your immediate execution. The feudal system that governed Japan during this period was built on the concept that every person had their predetermined place in society, and stepping outside those boundaries, even inadvertently, was considered not just rude or improper, but a crime punishable by death. At the top of this hierarchy sat the emperor, though during much of the feudal period, his power was largely ceremonial, with the real authority resting in the hands of the shogun, a military dictator who ruled through strength and the loyalty of powerful regional lords called daimyo. Below the daimyo were the samurai, the warrior class that formed the backbone of feudal Japanese society. And these weren't the noble, honorable warriors that Hollywood has portrayed them as, but rather brutal enforcers of the social order, who had the legal right to kill any peasant who showed them disrespect, a practice known as kirisuit gamen, which literally translates to permission to cut and leave. As a time traveler arriving in this world, you would almost certainly be classified as a peasant, since you lack the bloodline, training, or cultural understanding necessary to pass as anything else. And this means that your life would literally be in the hands of any samurai you might encounter. These warriors didn't just carry their swords for show. They were expected to use them to maintain their honor and the social order, and the smallest perceived slight could result in your head being separated from your shoulders, faster than you could apologize for whatever cultural faux pas you had unknowingly committed. The clothing you're wearing right now would mark you as a foreigner immediately, and in a society where xenophobia was not just common but actively encouraged by the ruling class, this would make you an object of suspicion and hostility wherever you went. The Japanese of the feudal period lived in almost complete isolation from the outside world, particularly after the Tokugawa shogunate implemented its policy of sakoku, or national isolation, in the early 1600s, which meant that most Japanese people had never seen a foreigner and would view you with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and disgust. Your modern clothes, made from synthetic materials and mass-produced in factories, would be completely incomprehensible to people who were accustomed to wearing simple garments made from hemp, cotton, or silk, depending on their social status. The bright colors and complex designs that we take for granted would mark you as either impossibly wealthy or dangerously foreign, neither of which would be particularly helpful for your survival in a world where standing out from the crowd could literally get you killed. Even if you somehow managed to acquire appropriate clothing, your behavior would still betray your foreign origins within minutes of interacting with anyone, because the social customs of feudal Japan were incredibly complex and nuanced, involving elaborate systems of bowing, specific ways of walking, talking, and even breathing that were determined by your social status relative to the person you were interacting with. The depth of your bow, the tone of your voice, the words you chose to use, and even the way you positioned your hands were all carefully codified. And getting any of these elements wrong could be interpreted as a deliberate insult worthy of violent retribution. Let's imagine you're walking down a dirt road in medieval Japan, perhaps heading toward what passes for a town in this era, and you encounter a samurai approaching from the opposite direction. Your modern instincts might tell you to nod politely and continue on your way, perhaps offering a friendly greeting as you pass. But this simple, well-meaning gesture could very well be the last thing you ever do, because in feudal Japan, peasants were expected to immediately drop to their knees and press their faces to the ground when a samurai passed by, remaining in that position until the warrior was completely out of sight. Failing to show this level of subservience wouldn't just be considered rude. It would be seen as a direct challenge to the natural order of society, an act of rebellion that demanded immediate and violent correction. The samurai would be within his legal rights, and indeed might feel obligated by his code of honor, to draw his sword and cut you down on the spot, and no one would question his actions or seek to punish him for what we would consider murder, because in the context of feudal Japanese society, you would have brought your death upon yourself through your ignorance and disrespect. But let's assume you somehow avoid this fatal encounter, perhaps by pure luck or by observing other peasants and mimicking their behavior, because there are countless other ways that your modern sensibilities and complete lack of cultural understanding would put you in mortal danger throughout what would likely be your first and final day in this harsh and unforgiving world. The food you would encounter, for instance, would be unlike anything you've ever experienced, not just in terms of flavor and preparation, but in terms of safety and hygiene. The Japanese diet during the feudal period consisted primarily of rice when it was available, along with vegetables, fish, and very occasionally some meat, though the consumption of four-legged animals was largely forbidden due to Buddhist influences that had been incorporated into Japanese culture. However, these weren't the carefully cultivated, pesticide-free, organically grown foods that health-conscious modern consumers seek out. They were often contaminated with parasites, bacteria, and other pathogens that would make most contemporary people violently ill within hours of consumption. Rice, the staple food of the Japanese diet, was often stored in conditions that would horrify modern food safety inspectors, sitting in wooden containers where rats and insects could freely contaminate it, while the water used to cook it came from wells, streams, or rivers that also served as disposal sites for human and animal waste. The fish that formed another crucial part of the diet was preserved using salt and fermentation techniques that, while effective for preventing spoilage in the short term, created conditions perfect for the growth of dangerous bacteria and parasites that could cause severe illness or death. Your modern digestive system, accustomed to processed foods, preservatives, and strict sanitary standards, would be completely unprepared for this assault of unfamiliar bacteria and parasites, and you would likely find yourself suffering from severe dysentery, food poisoning, or parasitic infections within hours of your first meal. The abdominal pain alone would be debilitating, but combined with the violent diarrhea and vomiting that would inevitably follow, you would quickly become dehydrated and weak, making you even more vulnerable to the countless other dangers that surrounded you in this hostile environment. And speaking of dangers, the wildlife of feudal Japan included predators that most modern people have never had to worry about, including wild boars that could easily kill a grown man, venomous snakes that lurked in the tall grass and dense forests that covered much of the country, and bears that were far more aggressive and dangerous than their modern descendants. Without the protection of modern firearms, pesticides, or even basic first aid supplies, a single encounter with any of these creatures could easily prove fatal, and there would be no emergency services to call, no hospitals to rush to, and no antibiotics to prevent infection from setting in. The weather would present another constant threat to your survival, because the clothing worn by peasants in feudal Japan provided minimal protection against the elements, and the housing available to the lower classes was little more than single-room structures made from wood, paper, and straw that offered virtually no insulation against cold or effective protection from rain and wind. During the winter months, temperatures could drop well below freezing, and without central heating, proper insulation, or even adequate clothing, hypothermia would be a constant danger, while the summer months brought stifling humidity, swarms of disease-carrying insects, and temperatures that could easily lead to heat stroke or dehydration. The work you would be expected to perform as a peasant would be backbreaking labor that began before dawn and continued until well after sunset, involving tasks like rice farming that required you to spend hours bent over in flooded fields, planting and harvesting crops by hand using tools that were little more than sharpened sticks and crude metal implements. Your soft modern hands would be torn to shreds within hours, developing painful blisters and cuts that would quickly become infected in the filthy conditions where you worked, and your back would be screaming in agony from the constant bending and lifting that this type of agriculture demanded. But even if you could somehow endure the physical demands of peasant life, the psychological stress of living in constant fear would likely drive you to the breaking point within days or even hours of your arrival in this medieval nightmare. Every interaction with another human being would be fraught with the potential for violence. Every meal would risk poisoning you. Every night would bring the possibility of attack from wild animals, bandits, or rival clans, and every sunrise would herald another day of grinding labor with no hope of escape or improvement in your circumstances. The concept of individual rights that we take for granted in the modern world simply didn't exist in feudal Japan, where peasants were considered property of their local daimyo, with no more autonomy or legal protection than livestock. You couldn't quit your job, move to a different location, or even get married without permission from your feudal lord. And disobedience or attempted escape was punishable by death, not just for you but potentially for your entire family, if you had been lucky enough to survive long enough to start one. Medical care, such as it was, consisted primarily of folk remedies, superstitious practices, and crude surgical procedures performed without anesthesia or proper sterilization, meaning that even minor injuries or illnesses that would be easily treatable today could quickly become life-threatening infections that would slowly and painfully kill you over the course of days or weeks. A simple cut from a farming tool could lead to tetanus, a minor fever could develop into pneumonia, and a broken bone could result in permanent disability or death from complications that modern medicine could easily prevent or cure. The social isolation you would experience as a foreigner in this xenophobic society would be crushing, because even if you managed to learn enough of the language to communicate basic concepts, you would never truly be accepted by the community, always viewed with suspicion and treated as an outsider who might bring bad luck, disease, or other misfortunes to the village. The loneliness would be compounded by the fact that there would be no books to read, no entertainment beyond the occasional religious festival, and no means of communication with the outside world that might offer hope of rescue or escape. Religion permeated every aspect of life in feudal Japan, but it wasn't the comforting, personal spirituality that many modern people enjoy. Instead, it was a complex mixture of Shintoism and Buddhism that demanded strict adherence to countless rituals, taboos, and behavioral requirements that would be completely foreign to someone from the modern era. Violating these religious customs, even accidentally, could result in your being ostracized from the community or worse, and the elaborate ceremonies and festivals that marked the passing of seasons and important events would require your participation, whether you understood their significance or not. The legal system of feudal Japan was based on the principle that might makes right, with justice being dispensed by local authorities who had absolute power over the lives and deaths of their subjects. There were no defense attorneys, no presumption of innocence, no appeals process, and no constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment, which meant that being accused of a crime, whether you were guilty or not, would likely result in torture, mutilation, or execution, often in front of crowds of spectators who viewed such events as entertainment. Even the simple act of getting from one place to another would be fraught with danger in a world where there were no paved roads, no bridges over major rivers, no maps to guide you, and no inns or hotels where you could safely spend the night. Bandits roamed the countryside, preying on travelers who were foolish enough to venture outside the relative safety of their villages, and the mountainous terrain that covers much of Japan was filled with treacherous paths, where a single misstep could send you tumbling to your death in a rocky ravine hundreds of feet below. The nights would be particularly terrifying, because without electric lighting, the darkness would be absolute, broken only by the occasional flickering flame of a torch or candle that would create dancing shadows and strange shapes that would play tricks on your imagination, making you jump at every sound and movement in the oppressive blackness that surrounded you. The nocturnal predators that hunted in this darkness would have every advantage over you, with their superior night vision, hearing, and knowledge of the terrain, while you stumbled around blind and helpless, an easy target for anything that might be stalking you through the forest. Your modern education, which you might think would give you some advantage in this primitive society, would actually work against you in many ways, because the scientific knowledge and rational thinking that we value today would be seen as heretical or dangerous by people who lived in a world governed by superstition, tradition, and unquestioning obedience to authority. suggesting that diseases were caused by germs rather than evil spirits, or that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around, could get you branded as a dangerous radical whose ideas threatened the very foundations of society. The communication barriers you would face would go far beyond just not speaking the language, because even if you could somehow master medieval Japanese, the cultural concepts and ways of thinking would be so different from your modern mindset that true understanding would be nearly impossible. The feudal Japanese worldview was shaped by centuries of isolation, rigid social hierarchies, and religious beliefs that were completely alien to contemporary Western thought, making meaningful dialogue or connection with the people around you extremely difficult, if not impossible. Water, something we take completely for granted in the modern world, would be a constant source of danger and illness in feudal Japan, where the same streams and wells that provided drinking water also served as repositories for human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff from primitive manufacturing processes. Cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases were common killers, and there was no way to purify water except by boiling it, assuming you had access to fuel for a fire and a container that could withstand the heat without melting or breaking. The climate of Japan, with its extreme seasonal variations, heavy rainfall during the monsoon season, and frequent natural disasters including earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions, would present challenges that your modern lifestyle has left you completely unprepared to handle. When the ground begins shaking violently beneath your feet, you wouldn't know whether to run outside or take shelter indoors, and either choice could prove fatal depending on the circumstances. While the primitive construction techniques used in feudal Japan meant that buildings were far more likely to collapse during seismic events than modern structures designed to withstand such forces. The insects of medieval Japan would be another constant torment, with mosquitoes carrying malaria and other diseases, fleas that spread plague and typhus, and countless other biting, stinging, and disease-carrying creatures that would make your life miserable while potentially killing you with the pathogens they transmitted. Without modern insect repellents, screens for windows and doors, or effective medical treatments for insect-borne illnesses, you would be completely defenseless against these tiny but deadly adversaries that swarmed around you in clouds during certain seasons. Your soft modern skin would be no match for the harsh conditions of feudal Japan, where exposure to sun, wind, and rain would quickly cause painful burns, chapping, and other injuries that would become infected without proper medical care. The rough homemade clothing worn by peasants would chafe and irritate your tender flesh, creating open sores that would attract flies and other scavengers, while providing entry points for bacteria and parasites that would cause additional health problems. Food storage and preservation were constant challenges in a world without refrigeration, chemical preservatives, or hermetically sealed containers, meaning that much of what you ate would be partially spoiled, contaminated with mold or bacteria, or infested with insects and rodents that had gotten into the grain stores and vegetable cellars where supplies were kept. The seasonal nature of food production meant that fresh fruits and vegetables were only available for brief periods during the year, while the rest of the time you would be forced to subsist on preserved foods that were often barely edible and provided minimal nutrition. The justice system of feudal Japan was notoriously cruel and arbitrary, with punishments that included being boiled alive, crucifixion, being torn apart by oxen, or having various body parts amputated for crimes that we would consider minor offenses today. Even being suspected of wrongdoing could result in torture designed to extract confessions, regardless of whether you were actually guilty of anything. And the concept of proportional punishment was completely foreign to a system that was designed primarily to instill fear and maintain social order through intimidation. Privacy, something that most modern people consider a basic human right, was virtually non-existent in feudal Japan, where entire families lived together in single-room dwellings with paper-thin walls that provided no sound insulation and minimal visual barrier between neighbors. Every aspect of your personal life would be subject to scrutiny and judgment by the community, from what you ate to whom you spoke with, to how you spent your leisure time. And stepping outside the narrow bounds of acceptable behavior would result in social ostracism that could be almost as devastating as physical punishment. The educational system, such as it existed, was reserved primarily for the upper classes, meaning that as a peasant you would be expected to remain ignorant and illiterate throughout your entire life, with no access to books, newspapers, or other sources of information that might broaden your understanding of the world beyond your immediate surroundings. This intellectual isolation would be particularly maddening for someone from the modern era who was accustomed to having instant access to virtually unlimited information through the internet and other electronic media. Transportation was primitive and dangerous, with most travel being done on foot along narrow, poorly maintained paths that wound through mountainous terrain filled with bandits, wild animals, and natural hazards that could kill you without warning. Horses were expensive luxury items reserved for the wealthy and powerful, while boats were crude affairs that offered little protection against storms and had a disturbing tendency to sink without warning, taking their passengers and cargo to the bottom of rivers, lakes, or coastal waters. The seasonal festivals and religious observances that punctuated the calendar would require your participation whether you understood their significance or not, and failing to show proper respect or enthusiasm during these events could mark you as a troublemaker or potential subversive who needed to be watched carefully by the local authorities. The elaborate rituals, specific prayers, and complex ceremonial requirements would be completely foreign to your modern sensibilities, yet you would be expected to perform them flawlessly or face the consequences of your ignorance. Bathing, something that most contemporary people do daily without thinking about it, was a rare luxury in feudal Japan that was typically reserved for special occasions or religious purification ceremonies. Most of the time, you would be expected to go weeks or even months without properly washing your body, leading to the accumulation of dirt, sweat, and body oils that would create ideal conditions for skin diseases, bacterial infections, and infestations of lice and other parasites that would make your life miserable while potentially transmitting serious illnesses. The tools and implements used for farming, crafting, and daily life in feudal Japan were crude, heavy, and dangerous, requiring skills and knowledge that took years to develop and master. Without proper training or experience, you would be likely to injure yourself severely while attempting to use these primitive devices, and the resulting wounds would be likely to become infected in the unsanitary conditions that prevailed throughout society, potentially leading to blood poisoning, gangrene, or other complications that could quickly prove fatal. Money, as we understand it today, barely existed in feudal Japan, where most economic transactions were conducted through barter systems that exchanged goods and services directly without the use of currency. This would make it extremely difficult for you to obtain the basic necessities of life, since you would have no marketable skills that would be valued by the local population, and your lack of understanding about relative values and traditional exchange rates would make you an easy target for exploitation and fraud. The political system was characterized by constant intrigue, shifting alliances, and sudden outbreaks of violence that could engulf entire regions without warning, as rival clans fought for control of territory, resources, and political influence. As a peasant caught in the middle of these conflicts, you would have no say in the decisions that determined your fate, yet you could easily become collateral damage when armies clashed or when victorious warlords decided to make examples of populations that had supported their enemies. Marriage and family relationships in feudal Japan were arranged by parents and community leaders based on economic and social considerations that had nothing to do with love, compatibility, or personal choice, meaning that you would have no control over whom you might be forced to marry, assuming you survived long enough for such arrangements to become relevant. The concept of romantic love was largely foreign to a society where marriage was viewed primarily as a business transaction designed to strengthen family alliances and ensure the continuation of bloodlines. The entertainment available to peasants was extremely limited and consisted primarily of seasonal festivals, religious ceremonies, and folk performances that would seem primitive and boring to someone accustomed to modern forms of recreation and amusement. There were no books to read, no games to play, no music to listen to except for the occasional performance by traveling musicians, and no sports or athletic competitions that weren't directly related to military training or religious observances. Personal hygiene was largely limited to occasional washing with cold water and crude soap made from animal fat and wood ashes, while dental care consisted of chewing on twigs or rough cloth to remove food particles and hopefully prevent the worst effects of tooth decay and gum disease. Without toothbrushes, toothpaste, dental floss, or professional dental care, your teeth would quickly deteriorate, leading to painful infections that could spread to other parts of your body and potentially kill you through blood poisoning or other complications. Sleep would be fitful and uncomfortable on thin mats spread over hard wooden floors, with no pillows, blankets, or other comforts that modern people consider essential for a good night's rest. The cold would keep you awake during winter months, while heat and humidity would make sleep difficult during the summer, and the constant noise from animals, insects, and other people living in close proximity would make it nearly impossible to get the deep, restorative sleep that your body would desperately need to recover from the physical demands of peasant life. The legal status of women was even more restrictive than that of male peasants, with females being considered property, first of their fathers and later of their husbands, having no legal rights, no ability to own property, and no recourse against abuse or mistreatment by the men who controlled their lives. If you happened to be a female time traveler, your situation would be even more desperate than that of a male, since you would be viewed as being inherently inferior and would be expected to show complete subservience to every man you encountered, regardless of his social status relative to your own. The medical knowledge of the time was based largely on superstition and tradition rather than scientific understanding, meaning that treatments for illness and injury were often more dangerous than the original problems they were intended to address. Bloodletting, herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness, and crude surgical procedures performed without anesthesia or proper sterilization were about the best medical care you could hope for, while serious injuries or illnesses would most likely result in a slow, painful death that could take days or weeks to finally claim your life. Communication over long distances was virtually impossible, since there were no postal systems, telegraph lines, or other means of sending messages quickly over significant distances, meaning that news of important events might take weeks or months to reach remote villages, if it reached them at all. This isolation would be particularly difficult for someone from the modern era, who was accustomed to being able to communicate instantly with people anywhere in the world through electronic media and transportation systems. The construction techniques used in feudal Japan produced buildings that were poorly insulated, prone to collapse during earthquakes or severe weather, and highly susceptible to fire, which was a constant threat in communities where open flames were used for lighting, cooking, and heating. When fires did break out, they often consumed entire neighborhoods or even whole towns. Since there were no fire departments, no fire-resistant building materials, and no effective means of fighting large blazes once they had gained momentum, your modern concepts of time would be completely irrelevant in a society that organized daily activities around the position of the sun, the changing of seasons, and religious observances rather than mechanical clocks, which were rare and expensive luxuries that most people never saw. The idea of punctuality, scheduling appointments, or meeting deadlines would be foreign concepts that would mark you as someone who didn't understand how normal people lived and worked in this pre-industrial world. The disposal of human waste was handled in ways that would horrify modern environmental and health officials, with raw sewage being dumped into streams, rivers, and fields where it contaminated water supplies and created breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and parasites. The smell alone would be overwhelming, but the health risks posed by this primitive waste management system would be even more dangerous, since waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery were major killers that could wipe out entire communities during epidemic outbreaks. Personal safety was entirely your own responsibility in a world where there were no police forces, no emergency services, and no government agencies dedicated to protecting citizens from crime, natural disasters, or other dangers. If you were attacked by bandits, mauled by wild animals, or injured in an accident, you would be entirely dependent on whatever help your neighbors might be willing and able to provide, assuming they weren't too busy dealing with their own survival challenges to worry about your problems. The concept of childhood as we understand it today was virtually non-existent in feudal Japan, where children were expected to begin contributing to the families. Survival from the moment they were old enough to walk and follow simple instructions. By the age of 5 or 6, peasant children were already working in the fields, caring for younger siblings, and performing household tasks that would be considered child labor by modern standards, while children from samurai families were beginning their military training with wooden swords and rigorous physical conditioning that would continue throughout their youth. If you had somehow managed to bring children with you on your time travel adventure, their chances of survival would be even lower than your own, since infant and child mortality rates in feudal Japan were astronomical by contemporary standards, with diseases like smallpox, measles, and various respiratory infections claiming the lives of more than half of all children before they reached their 5th birthday. The lack of vaccines, antibiotics, and proper medical care meant that illnesses that are easily preventable or treatable today would be death sentences for young people whose immune systems hadn't yet developed the strength to fight off serious infections. The educational opportunities available to children were extremely limited and class-dependent, with peasant children receiving no formal schooling whatsoever and learning only the specific skills they would need to perform their predetermined roles in society, while children from wealthy families might receive instruction in reading, writing, mathematics, and classical literature, but only if their parents could afford to hire private tutors or send them to temple schools run by Buddhist monks. Even if you somehow managed to adapt to the physical hardships, social restrictions, and constant dangers of feudal Japanese life, the psychological toll of living in such a harsh and unforgiving environment would likely drive you to the breaking point within a matter of days or weeks. as the stress of constant vigilance, physical pain, and social isolation combined with the knowledge that your situation would never improve and that death could come at any moment from any number of causes completely beyond your control. The concept of personal privacy that we take for granted in the modern world was completely foreign to feudal Japanese society, where every aspect of your life would be subject to scrutiny and control by your social superiors, from what you ate and wore to whom you spoke with, and how you spent your free time, assuming you had any free time at all after completing the backbreaking labor that was required to meet your obligations to your feudal lord and ensure your family's basic survival. Weather patterns in medieval Japan were often more extreme than what we experience today, with longer, harsher winters that could last for months without relief, and summers that brought not only oppressive heat and humidity, but also violent storms, flooding, and other natural disasters that could destroy crops, homes, and entire communities with little or no warning. Without modern weather forecasting, early warning systems, or disaster preparedness measures, you would be completely vulnerable to these natural forces that could kill you as easily as any human enemy. The tools used for farming and other essential activities were primitive and dangerous, often little more than sharpened sticks, crude metal implements, and heavy wooden devices that required considerable skill and experience to use safely and effectively. And without proper training, you would be likely to injure yourself severely while attempting to perform the basic tasks necessary for survival in this agricultural society. Food preparation was a time-consuming and potentially dangerous process that involved using open fires, sharp knives, and primitive cooking vessels that could easily cause burns, cuts, or other injuries if you didn't know exactly what you were doing. And the lack of refrigeration meant that determining whether food was safe to eat required knowledge and experience that took years to develop, with mistakes often resulting in food poisoning that could be fatal in a world without modern medical treatment. The social customs governing interactions between people of different classes, genders, and ages were incredibly complex and nuanced, with specific rules for everything from how to bow and when to speak to what words to use, and how to position your body during conversations. And violating these unwritten but strictly enforced protocols could result in anything from social ostracism to violent punishment, depending on the severity of your transgression and the social status of the person you had offended. Marriage in feudal Japan was not a matter of personal choice or romantic attraction, but rather a business arrangement designed to strengthen family alliances, consolidate property holdings, and ensure the continuation of bloodlines, with matches being arranged by parents and community leaders based on economic and social considerations that had nothing to do with the feelings or preferences of the individuals involved. And refusing to accept an arranged marriage could result in being disowned by your family and cast out of the community. The legal system was based on the principle that social superiors had absolute authority over their inferiors, with local lords serving as judge, jury, and executioner for any disputes or crimes that occurred within their territories, and there were no appeals processes, no constitutional protections, and no presumption of innocence for accused individuals, who could be tortured, mutilated, or executed based on nothing more than the word of someone higher up in the social hierarchy. Personal hygiene was largely limited to occasional washing with cold water and crude soap made from animal fat and plant ashes, while dental care consisted of chewing on fibrous plants or rough cloth to remove food particles and hopefully prevent the worst effects of tooth decay and gum disease that were endemic throughout the population. And without modern dental tools, techniques, or materials, most people suffered from chronic pain, infection, and eventual tooth loss that could make eating difficult and lead to malnutrition. The housing available to peasants consisted of single-room structures made from wood, bamboo, paper, and straw that provided minimal protection from the elements and virtually no privacy from neighbors, who lived just a few feet away, with entire families sleeping together on thin mats spread over hard wooden floors. And the lack of insulation meant that these dwellings were freezing cold in winter and stifling hot in summer, while the primitive construction techniques made them highly vulnerable to fires, earthquakes, and severe weather. Transportation was limited to walking, or, for the wealthy, riding horses or traveling in crude carts pulled by oxen or other draft animals, with most roads being nothing more than narrow dirt paths that became muddy quagmires during the rainy season and were often impassable during winter months, while rivers and coastal waters were crossed using primitive boats that had a disturbing tendency to sink during storms or when overloaded with passengers and cargo. The entertainment available to peasants was extremely limited and consisted primarily of seasonal festivals, religious ceremonies, and occasional visits by traveling performers who might sing songs, tell stories, or perform simple magic tricks. But these events were rare and usually tied to religious or agricultural observances rather than being designed purely for enjoyment. And the rest of the time you would have no books to read, no games to play, and no other diversions from the grinding routine of daily survival. Work began before sunrise and continued until well after sunset, with peasants spending most of their waking hours engaged in backbreaking agricultural labor that involved planting, weeding, and harvesting crops by hand using primitive tools, while also maintaining their homes, caring for livestock, and performing various crafts and household tasks that were necessary for survival. And there were no weekends, vacations, or holidays that weren't tied to religious observances or agricultural cycles. The economic system was based primarily on subsistence agriculture and barter exchanges, with most peasants producing just enough food to survive while turning over a substantial portion of their harvest to their feudal lords as taxes, tribute, or rent. And any crop failures, natural disasters, or military conflicts could quickly lead to famine conditions that would claim thousands of lives through starvation and related diseases. Crime was dealt with swiftly and brutally, with punishments including public flogging, amputation of hands or feet, branding, exile, and execution by various gruesome methods depending on the nature of the offense and the social status of both the criminal and the victim. And the concept of rehabilitation or proportional punishment was completely foreign to a justice system that was designed primarily to deter crime through fear and intimidation. Medical knowledge was based largely on superstition, folk remedies, and traditional practices that had been passed down through generations without any scientific understanding of how the human body actually worked. And treatments for illness and injury often involved bloodletting, herbal concoctions of questionable effectiveness, crude surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, and various ritual practices designed to drive away evil spirits that were believed to cause disease. The political situation was characterized by constant warfare between rival clans and territories, with alliances shifting frequently and entire regions being devastated by military campaigns that could last for months or years, while peasants caught in these conflicts had no choice but to provide food, labor, and sometimes military service to whichever warlord happened to control their area at any given time. Natural disasters were common and devastating, with earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, floods, droughts, and severe storms regularly destroying crops, homes, and entire communities, while the lack of early warning systems, disaster preparedness measures, or effective emergency response capabilities meant that these events often resulted in massive casualties and long-term hardship for survivors. The isolation of Japan from the rest of the world meant that new ideas, technologies, and medical knowledge spread very slowly, if at all, leaving the population vulnerable to diseases and other problems that had been solved or mitigated in other parts of the world, while also creating a xenophobic culture that viewed foreigners with suspicion and hostility. Religious practices permeated every aspect of daily life, with complex rituals and observances marking important events, seasonal changes, and life transitions, and failing to participate properly in these ceremonies or showing disrespect for religious traditions could result in social ostracism or worse, while the mixture of Shintoism and Buddhism that dominated Japanese spirituality required adherence to countless rules and taboos that would be completely foreign to modern sensibilities. Personal relationships were governed by rigid social hierarchies that determined who you could speak to, how you could interact with them, and what topics were appropriate for discussion, with violations of these unwritten but strictly enforced protocols potentially resulting in severe punishment for both parties involved. And the concept of equality between individuals was completely foreign to a society built on the premise that some people were inherently superior to others. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant that there were periods of intense labor during planting and harvesting seasons, followed by relatively quiet periods during winter months. But even during these slower times, peasants were expected to engage in various crafts, maintenance activities, and other tasks that would help ensure their survival through the harsh winter months, when food was scarce and heating fuel was precious. Water sources were often contaminated with human and animal waste, industrial runoff from primitive manufacturing processes, and various pathogens that could cause serious illness or death. And the lack of effective water purification methods meant that waterborne diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever were constant threats that could kill entire families or communities during epidemic outbreaks. The clothing worn by peasants was made from rough, homespun fabrics that provided minimal protection from the elements while being uncomfortable against the skin, and the lack of variety in both style and color meant that everyone in the lower classes dressed almost identically, with social status being immediately apparent from the quality and type of garments a person wore. Insect-borne diseases were common and often fatal, with mosquitoes carrying malaria and other pathogens, fleas spreading plague and typhus, and various other biting and stinging creatures transmitting diseases that modern medicine can easily prevent or treat, but which were death sentences in a world without effective insect control measures or medical treatments. The justice system was arbitrary and cruel, with punishments often being determined by the mood and personal preferences of local authorities rather than by any consistent legal principles. And the concept of due process or fair trials was completely foreign to a system where accusations were often treated as proof of guilt, and torture was routinely used to extract confessions, regardless of whether the accused person was actually guilty of anything. Food storage was a constant challenge in a world without refrigeration or effective preservation methods, with grain and other staples being stored in primitive containers that were vulnerable to moisture, rodents, insects, and other forms of contamination that could render entire food supplies inedible and lead to famine conditions, even when crops had been adequate during the growing season. The educational system, such as it existed, was reserved primarily for the upper classes and focused on classical literature, calligraphy, and other subjects that had little practical application for people whose lives were devoted to physical labor and basic survival. while peasants remained illiterate and ignorant of developments in other parts of the world that might have improved their living conditions. Personal safety was entirely your own responsibility, with no police forces, emergency services, or other government agencies dedicated to protecting citizens from crime, accidents, or natural disasters. And if you were injured, attacked, or otherwise found yourself in danger, you would be entirely dependent on whatever help your family and neighbors might be willing and able to provide. The concept of individual rights was completely foreign to a society where people were viewed as property of their feudal lords and had no legal standing or protection against abuse, exploitation, or arbitrary punishment, with even minor infractions potentially resulting in death sentences that could be carried out immediately without any form of trial or appeal process. Seasonal festivals and religious observances required elaborate preparations and participation from entire communities, with specific roles and responsibilities being assigned based on social status, gender, and age, and failing to fulfill these obligations properly could result in social ostracism or worse, while the complex rituals and ceremonies involved would be completely incomprehensible to someone from the modern era. The tools used for various crafts and trades were primitive and dangerous, requiring years of training and experience to use safely and effectively. And without proper instruction, attempting to work with these implements would likely result in serious injuries that could become infected and lead to blood poisoning, gangrene, or other complications that could prove fatal in a world without modern medical care. Communication was limited to face-to-face conversations and simple written messages for those who could read and write, which excluded the vast majority of the population. And news of important events might take weeks or months to travel between different regions, if it traveled at all, leaving most people completely ignorant of developments that could affect their lives. The political system was characterized by violence and instability, with power struggles between rival clans resulting in frequent warfare that devastated entire regions and left peasants vulnerable to attack, displacement, and exploitation by whichever military force happened to be in control of their area at any given time. Marriage customs required elaborate negotiations between families and involved the exchange of goods and services rather than being based on personal attraction or compatibility. And once married, couples were expected to remain together regardless of abuse, incompatibility, or other problems that might arise, with divorce being virtually impossible except under very specific circumstances. The waste disposal systems consisted of primitive latrines built over pits that were rarely emptied or maintained properly, creating breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and contaminating groundwater supplies that were used for drinking, cooking, and other household purposes, while the smell and unsanitary conditions would be overwhelming for someone accustomed to modern plumbing and waste treatment facilities. Personal grooming was limited to occasional washing and crude dental care, with most people suffering from various skin conditions, dental problems, and other hygiene-related issues that would be easily preventable today. And the lack of mirrors, proper lighting, and grooming tools meant that maintaining even basic cleanliness was a significant challenge. The climate could be harsh and unpredictable, with extreme temperatures, heavy rainfall during monsoon seasons, and various natural disasters that could strike without warning, while the primitive housing and lack of effective heating or cooling systems left people vulnerable to hypothermia, heat stroke, and other weather-related health problems. Work-related injuries were common and often resulted in permanent disability or death, since the tools and techniques used for agriculture, construction, and other essential activities were dangerous, and the lack of safety equipment or procedures meant that Accidents were frequent and often severe, while the absence of effective medical treatment meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening infections. Social mobility was virtually non-existent, with people being born into specific social classes and expected to remain there for their entire lives. And any attempt to rise above your predetermined station in life was viewed as a threat to the natural order and could result in severe punishment from the authorities who benefited from maintaining the existing power structure. The diet was monotonous and often inadequate, consisting primarily of rice when available, along with vegetables, fish, and occasionally small amounts of meat. But the quality and quantity of food varied dramatically based on weather conditions, military conflicts, and other factors beyond individual control. And malnutrition was common even among those who managed to avoid outright starvation. Religious obligations required participation in complex ceremonies and rituals that could last for hours or even days, with specific requirements for clothing, behavior, and spoken responses that would be completely foreign to modern people. And failing to perform these duties correctly could result in accusations of impiety or heresy that carried severe penalties, including exile or execution. The legal system provided no protection for the weak or powerless, with justice being determined by social status rather than by facts or evidence. And accusations by higher-ranking individuals were automatically believed, while testimony from peasants was considered worthless, meaning that you could be convicted and punished for crimes you didn't commit, based on nothing more than the word of someone who outranked you in the social hierarchy. Transportation over long distances was dangerous and time-consuming, with travelers being vulnerable to attack by bandits, wild animals, and hostile military forces, while the lack of good roads, reliable maps, or safe lodging meant that even short journeys could become life-threatening adventures that might end in robbery, injury, or death far from home. The economic system was based on subsistence agriculture that left no room for error, with crop failures, natural disasters, or military campaigns potentially leading to famine conditions that could claim thousands of lives. While the lack of food storage and distribution systems meant that abundance in one region could coexist with starvation in areas just a few miles away. Medical care was primitive and often harmful, with treatments based on superstition rather than scientific knowledge, and many remedies were more dangerous than the conditions they were supposed to cure. While surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or proper sterilization, leading to high rates of infection, complications, and death even from minor operations. The isolation of individual communities meant that local disasters or problems could not be addressed through outside assistance, leaving people to cope with floods, fires, crop failures, and other emergencies using only their own limited resources. And entire villages could be wiped out by events that would be considered minor inconveniences in the modern world. Personal relationships were governed by complex social rules that determined appropriate behavior between people of different ages, genders, and social classes, with violations of these protocols potentially resulting in serious consequences for everyone involved. And the concept of treating people as equals, regardless of their background, was completely foreign to this hierarchical society. The working day began before dawn and continued until well after sunset, with no concept of overtime pay, vacation time, or worker safety regulations. And peasants were expected to perform whatever tasks their feudal lords demanded, regardless of the personal cost in terms of health, family time, or other considerations that we take for granted today. Natural lighting was the only illumination available after sunset, with candles and oil lamps being expensive luxuries that most people couldn't afford. And the darkness that enveloped communities every night was complete, and often frightening, filled with strange sounds and movements that could indicate the presence of wild animals, criminals, or other threats. The seasonal cycle of agricultural work meant that there were periods of frantic activity during planting and harvesting seasons, followed by long stretches of relative inactivity during winter months. But even during these quieter periods, peasants were expected to engage in various maintenance tasks, craft production, and other activities that were necessary for survival. Water was often scarce during dry periods and contaminated during wet seasons, with the same sources being used for drinking, cooking, washing, and waste disposal, creating ideal conditions for the spread of waterborne diseases that could decimate entire communities during epidemic outbreaks that had no effective treatment or prevention methods. The clothing worn by different social classes was strictly regulated by law, with peasants being forbidden to wear certain colors, fabrics, or styles that were reserved for their social superiors, and violations of these sumptuary laws could result in fines, imprisonment, or other punishments that reinforced the rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of society. Crime was often committed out of desperation by people who had no other means of survival, but the punishments were so severe that even minor offenses like stealing food could result in death sentences that were carried out publicly as a warning to others who might be tempted to violate the law. The political situation was constantly changing as different warlords fought for control of territory and resources, with alliances forming and dissolving rapidly as circumstances changed. And peasants caught in the middle of these conflicts had no choice but to serve whichever military force controlled their area, regardless of their personal feelings about the legitimacy or morality of their rulers. Education was limited to practical skills that were directly related to survival and economic productivity, with peasants learning only what they needed to know to perform their assigned roles in society, while broader knowledge about the world, history, science, or philosophy was considered unnecessary and potentially dangerous for people of lower social status. The justice system was designed to maintain social order, rather than to ensure fairness or protect individual rights, with harsh punishments being imposed not only on criminals, but also on their families and associates as a way of deterring others from similar behavior. And collective punishment was considered an acceptable way of maintaining discipline within communities. Personal privacy was virtually non-existent, with people living in close quarters where every conversation could be overheard and every action observed by neighbors, who might report suspicious or inappropriate behavior to local authorities. And the concept of individual autonomy was completely foreign to a society where conformity and obedience were valued above personal freedom. The diet lacked many essential nutrients that we take for granted today, leading to various deficiency diseases that could cause blindness, mental retardation, bone deformities, and other serious health problems. While the limited variety of available foods made meals monotonous and often unpalatable by modern standards, work-related diseases were common and often fatal, with farmers developing respiratory problems from exposure to dust and mold, craftsmen suffering from repetitive stress injuries and exposure to toxic materials, and everyone being vulnerable to accidents that could result in permanent disability or death in a world without effective medical treatment or workplace safety regulations. The seasonal availability of food meant that certain times of year brought relative abundance, while others brought near starvation conditions, with the period just before harvest being particularly dangerous as stored grain from the previous year ran low, and new crops had not yet ripened, creating what was euphemistically called the hungry season, when entire families might subsist on little more than gruel made from tree bark, grass, and whatever else could be found to fill empty stomachs. Sleep patterns were dictated entirely by the natural cycle of daylight and darkness, since artificial lighting was expensive and scarce, meaning that people went to bed shortly after sunset and woke before dawn, with no opportunity for the kind of flexible scheduling that modern people take for granted, and the quality of sleep was often poor due to uncomfortable sleeping surfaces, inadequate bedding, and the constant noise from animals, insects, and other people living in close proximity. The concept of retirement was completely unknown in feudal Japan, where people were expected to work until they literally could not continue, and elderly individuals who could no longer contribute to their family's survival were often viewed as burdens who consumed precious resources without providing any benefit in return, leading to situations where aging parents might be abandoned or even killed when their continued existence threatened the survival of younger family members. Personal hygiene practices that we consider essential today were either unknown or impractical for most people, with toothbrushing being done using twigs or rough cloth, bathing being limited to occasional washing with cold water, and clean clothing being a luxury that most peasants could afford only rarely, if at all, leading to widespread problems with body odor, skin diseases, and dental decay that would be considered shocking by contemporary standards. The treatment of mental illness was based entirely on superstition and often involved brutal methods designed to drive out evil spirits that were believed to be responsible for abnormal behavior, with mentally ill individuals being subjected to beatings, isolation, religious exorcisms, and other traumatic experiences that often made their conditions worse rather than better. While the concept of compassionate mental health care was completely foreign to this society, fire was a constant threat in communities where buildings were constructed primarily from wood, paper, and other flammable materials, and where open flames were used for cooking, heating, and lighting. And when fires did break out, they often consumed entire neighborhoods or towns since there were no fire departments, no firefighting equipment, and no building codes designed to prevent the spread of flames from one structure to another. The legal system made no distinction between different types of mental capacity, meaning that children, mentally ill individuals, and people with developmental disabilities were held to the same standards of behavior and faced the same punishments as healthy adults, leading to situations where people who could not understand or control their actions might be tortured or executed for crimes they were incapable of comprehending. Pregnancy and childbirth were extremely dangerous for both mothers and babies, with maternal mortality rates being astronomically high by modern standards due to the complete lack of medical knowledge about obstetrics, the absence of sterile conditions during delivery, and the inability to deal with complications that arise during labor. While infant mortality was so common that many families didn't even name their children until they had survived their first year of life. The disposal of dead bodies was handled in ways that would horrify modern public health officials, with corpses often being buried in shallow graves that could contaminate groundwater supplies, or left in remote locations where they would decompose naturally and attract scavengers that might spread disease to nearby communities, while the lack of embalming or other preservation methods meant that bodies had to be disposed of quickly before they began to rot and create additional health hazards. Personal possessions were extremely limited for most people, who might own nothing more than the clothes on their backs, a few crude tools, and perhaps some basic cooking utensils, with the concept of accumulating material goods for comfort or status being completely foreign to individuals whose entire existence was focused on immediate survival. And theft of even the most trivial items could result in severe punishment, since losing essential tools or clothing could mean the difference between life and death. The seasonal migration patterns of various diseases meant that certain times of year brought epidemic outbreaks that could kill significant portions of the population in affected areas, with communities having no way to prepare for or defend against these medical disasters. That struck without warning and spread rapidly through populations that had no immunity to unfamiliar pathogens and no effective treatments for serious illnesses. Social customs required elaborate displays of respect and deference that could take hours to perform properly, with specific rituals for greeting people of different social ranks, conducting business transactions, and participating in community events. And these ceremonies were not optional social niceties, but rather essential survival skills, since failing to show appropriate respect could result in violent retaliation from offended individuals who had the power to destroy your life with a single word or gesture. The economic system provided no safety net for people who became unable to work due to injury, illness, or old age, meaning that losing your capacity for physical labor essentially amounted to a death sentence. Since there were no government programs, charitable organizations, or other sources of support for individuals who could not contribute to their own survival through productive work. Transportation of goods over long distances was so difficult and expensive that most communities were essentially self-sufficient by necessity, producing everything they needed locally and having little or no contact with the outside world, which meant that technological innovations, medical discoveries, and other improvements that might have made life easier or safer spread very slowly, if at all, between different regions. The justice system included punishments that were specifically designed to be as painful and humiliating as possible, not just to deter crime, but also to provide entertainment for spectators who viewed public executions and tortures as acceptable forms of recreation. And these events often drew large crowds who cheered and jeered at the suffering of condemned individuals, regardless of whether their crimes actually warranted such extreme penalties. Religious obligations extended far beyond simple belief or worship and included complex dietary restrictions, behavioral requirements, and ritual observances that governed every aspect of daily life, with violations of these religious laws being considered crimes against both the spiritual and temporal authorities. And punishment for religious infractions could be even more severe than penalties for secular crimes. The tools used for agriculture and other essential activities were not only primitive and dangerous, but also extremely expensive relative to people's incomes, meaning that losing or breaking essential implements could create financial hardships that might take years to overcome. While the lack of standardization meant that tools made by different craftsmen might not be interchangeable, making repairs and replacements even more difficult and costly. Weather patterns were more extreme and unpredictable than what we experience today, with longer droughts, more severe storms, and temperature variations that could kill crops, destroy homes, and claim human lives with little or no warning. While the absence of meteorological knowledge or forecasting capabilities meant that people had no way to prepare for or mitigate the effects of dangerous weather conditions. The political system was characterized by arbitrary rule and sudden policy changes that could dramatically affect people's lives without any consultation or consideration of their needs and preferences, with new taxes, military conscription, religious requirements, or legal restrictions being imposed whenever rulers decided they were necessary. Regardless of the hardships these changes might create for ordinary citizens, personal relationships between men and women were governed by strict rules that prohibited most forms of casual interaction and required constant supervision to prevent inappropriate behavior, with violations of these social norms potentially resulting in severe punishment for both parties. including forced marriage, exile, or even execution, depending on the circumstances and the social status of the individuals involved. The educational system, such as it existed, was designed primarily to reinforce existing social hierarchies rather than to provide practical knowledge or skills that might improve people's lives, with children being taught to accept their predetermined roles in society without question and to show unquestioning obedience to their social superiors, regardless of how unreasonable or harmful their demands might be. Medical knowledge was not only primitive, but often actively harmful, with treatments based on the belief that illness was caused by imbalances in bodily humors, evil spirits, or punishment for moral failings, leading to practices like bloodletting, purging, and various forms of torture that were thought to cure disease, but actually weakened patients and often hastened their deaths. The isolation of Japan from the rest of the world meant that innovations and improvements that were being developed in other parts of the globe took centuries to reach Japanese communities, if they arrived at all, leaving the population vulnerable to problems and dangers that had been solved elsewhere and causing unnecessary suffering that could have been prevented with access to more advanced knowledge and technology. Food preparation and storage methods were not only primitive, but also dangerous, with contamination being a constant threat due to the lack of understanding about bacteria, parasites, and other microorganisms that could cause serious illness or death, while the absence of effective preservation techniques meant that food spoilage was common and entire food supplies could be lost to mold, insects, or rodents. The concept of individual privacy was not only absent, but actually viewed as suspicious and potentially dangerous, since people who sought to be alone or keep secrets were assumed to be plotting against the established order or engaging in immoral behavior, and attempts to maintain personal boundaries or avoid surveillance could result in accusations of disloyalty or subversion. Work environments were extremely hazardous, with no safety equipment, protective clothing, or regulations designed to prevent accidents and injuries, while exposure to toxic materials, dangerous tools, and harmful working conditions was considered an unavoidable part of life that workers were expected to endure without complaint, regardless of the long-term effects on their health and well-being. The seasonal cycle of festivals and religious observances required enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources that most people could ill afford. But participation was mandatory, and failure to contribute adequately to these community events could result in social ostracism or worse, while the elaborate preparations and performances involved often took precedence over essential activities like food production and home maintenance. Natural disasters struck frequently and without warning, with earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, and severe storms regularly devastating entire regions and claiming thousands of lives, while the lack of early warning systems, emergency preparedness measures, or effective disaster response capabilities meant that these events often resulted in long-term hardship and suffering for survivors who had no outside assistance to help them rebuild their lives. The legal system provided no protection against false accusations or malicious prosecution, with individuals being able to destroy their enemies simply by making unfounded claims of criminal behavior. And once accused, defendants had virtually no chance of proving their innocence, since the burden of proof rested entirely on them, and the testimony of their accusers was automatically believed regardless of their motives or credibility. Personal grooming and appearance were strictly regulated by law and custom, with people being required to dress and style themselves according to their social status, and violations of these sumptuary laws could result in fines, imprisonment, or other punishments that served to reinforce the rigid class distinctions that governed every aspect of society. The economic system was based on subsistence agriculture that provided no margin for error, with crop failures, natural disasters, or military conflicts potentially leading to famine conditions that could claim entire populations, while the lack of trade networks and food distribution systems meant that abundance in one area could coexist with starvation in regions just a short distance away. Marriage customs required elaborate negotiations between families that could take months or years to complete, with the actual preferences and feelings of the individuals involved being considered irrelevant compared to the economic and social benefits that the union might provide to their respective families. And once married, couples were expected to remain together regardless of abuse, incompatibility, or other serious problems that might arise. The disposal of human waste was handled through primitive systems that created serious health hazards for entire communities, with raw sewage contaminating water supplies, breeding disease-carrying insects, and creating foul odors that would be overwhelming for anyone accustomed to modern sanitation facilities. While the lack of understanding about the connection between waste management and public health meant that these problems were considered normal and unavoidable. Personal safety was entirely dependent on your ability to defend yourself or find protection from more powerful individuals. Since there were no police forces, emergency services, or other institutions designed to protect ordinary citizens from crime, violence, or other dangers, and if you were attacked, robbed, or otherwise victimized, you would have no recourse except whatever revenge you might be able to exact through your own efforts or those of your family and friends. The climate could be harsh and unpredictable, with extreme temperatures, severe storms, and other weather conditions that could kill crops, destroy homes, and claim human lives, while the primitive construction techniques used in building homes and other structures provided minimal protection from the elements and made people vulnerable to hypothermia, heat stroke, and other weather-related health problems. Religious practices permeated every aspect of daily life and included complex rituals, dietary restrictions, and behavioral requirements that would be completely foreign to modern people, with violations of these religious obligations being considered serious crimes that could result in severe punishment from both spiritual and temporal authorities who worked together to maintain social control. The tools and weapons used in feudal Japan were not only primitive by modern standards, but also extremely dangerous to use without proper training and experience. And attempting to work with these implements without adequate knowledge could result in serious injuries that would likely become infected and potentially prove fatal in a world without effective medical treatment or surgical techniques. Communication over long distances was virtually impossible except for the wealthy and powerful who could afford to send messengers on horseback, while ordinary people had no way to contact family members, friends, or business associates who lived more than a few miles away, creating a sense of isolation and disconnection that would be particularly difficult for someone accustomed to modern telecommunications and transportation systems. The political system was characterized by constant warfare and instability, with different factions fighting for control of territory and resources, while ordinary citizens were caught in the middle of these conflicts and forced to provide food, labor, and sometimes military service to whichever warlord happened to control their area at any given time, regardless of their personal feelings about the legitimacy or morality of their rulers. Education was limited to practical skills that were directly related to survival and economic productivity, with the vast majority of the population remaining illiterate throughout their entire lives and having no access to books, newspapers, or other sources of information that might broaden their understanding of the world beyond their immediate surroundings. While formal schooling was reserved for the wealthy elite who could afford private tutors, the justice system was designed primarily to maintain social order and reinforce existing power structures rather than to ensure fairness or protect individual rights, with punishments being determined by the social status of both the accused and the victim rather than by the actual facts of the case, and harsh penalties being imposed not only on criminals, but also on their families and associates as a way of deterring similar behavior. Personal relationships were governed by complex social rules that determined appropriate behavior between people of different ages, genders, and social classes, with violations of these unwritten but strictly enforced protocols potentially resulting in serious consequences for everyone involved. And the concept of treating people as equals, regardless of their background, being completely foreign to this hierarchical society. The working day began before dawn and continued until well after sunset, with no concept of overtime pay, vacation time, or worker safety regulations, and peasants being expected to perform whatever tasks their feudal lords demanded, regardless of the personal cost in terms of health, family relationships, or other considerations that we take for granted in the modern world. Natural lighting was the only illumination available after sunset, with candles and oil lamps being expensive luxuries that most people could not afford, and the darkness that enveloped communities every night being complete and often frightening, filled with strange sounds and movements that could indicate the presence of wild animals, criminals, or other threats that posed serious dangers to anyone who ventured outside after dark. The seasonal cycle of agricultural work meant that there were periods of frantic activity during planting and harvesting seasons, followed by long stretches of relative inactivity during winter months. But even during these supposedly quieter periods, peasants were expected to engage in various maintenance tasks, craft production, and other activities that were necessary for survival and preparation for the next growing season. Water quality was often poor and sometimes dangerous, with the same sources being used for drinking, cooking, washing, livestock, and waste disposal, creating ideal conditions for the spread of waterborne diseases that could decimate entire communities during epidemic outbreaks that had no effective treatment or prevention methods available to combat their spread. The clothing worn by different social classes was strictly regulated by law, with peasants being forbidden to wear certain colors, fabrics, or styles that were reserved for their social superiors, and violations of these sumptuary laws could result in fines, imprisonment, or other punishments that served to reinforce the rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of society and made social mobility virtually impossible. Crime was often committed out of desperation by people who had no other means of survival, but the punishments were so severe and publicly displayed that even minor offenses like stealing food to feed starving children could result in death sentences that were carried out in front of crowds who viewed these executions as acceptable forms of entertainment and moral instruction. The political situation remained in constant flux as different warlords and their armies swept across the countryside, leaving destruction and chaos in their wake, with peasants being forced to flee their homes, abandon their crops, and seek refuge in mountains or forests where they might survive by eating roots, berries, and whatever small animals they could catch. While their villages burned and their carefully tended fields were trampled by horses and devastated by the passage of military forces that cared nothing for the lives and livelihoods of ordinary people. Education for the masses was not just limited, but actively discouraged by ruling authorities who understood that ignorant populations were easier to control and exploit with reading and writing being viewed as potentially dangerous skills that might enable peasants to communicate with each other, organize resistance movements, or gain access to ideas that could threaten the established social order. While those few individuals who did manage to acquire literacy often found themselves under suspicion from both their social superiors and their peers, the justice system included forms of collective punishment that held entire families, neighborhoods, or even villages responsible for the crimes of individual members, meaning that a single person's transgression could result in death sentences, property confiscation, or exile for dozens of innocent people who had no involvement in or knowledge of the original offense, creating an atmosphere of mutual surveillance and betrayal where neighbors watched each other constantly for signs of potentially criminal behavior. Personal hygiene practices were not merely primitive, but often counterproductive, with some traditional remedies and cleansing rituals actually increasing the risk of infection and disease, while the complete absence of understanding about bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms meant that practices we now know to be essential for preventing illness were unknown, ignored, or sometimes actively prohibited by religious or cultural taboos. The seasonal food shortages became so severe in some years that entire populations resorted to eating grass, tree bark, clay, and even human flesh in desperate attempts to survive famines that could last for months, with parents sometimes being forced to choose which of their children would receive the last scraps of available food while others were abandoned or sold into slavery in the hope that they might find better conditions elsewhere. Work-related accidents and injuries were not just common, but virtually inevitable given the dangerous tools, hazardous working conditions, and complete absence of safety precautions that characterized most forms of labor. And these injuries often resulted in permanent disability, chronic pain, or slow death from infections that could have been easily prevented or treated with modern medical knowledge and techniques. The religious establishment wielded enormous power over every aspect of daily life, not just through spiritual authority, but through direct control of education, healthcare, legal proceedings, and economic activities, with monks and priests serving as judges, teachers, doctors, and tax collectors who could make life or death decisions about ordinary citizens based on their adherence to complex and often contradictory religious doctrines. Natural disasters struck with terrifying regularity and devastating impact, with earthquakes capable of leveling entire cities in a matter of minutes, tsunamis that could wash away coastal communities without warning, volcanic eruptions that buried regions under ash and lava, floods that destroyed years of agricultural work, and droughts that could turn fertile farmland into barren wasteland where nothing would grow for seasons or even years. The isolation imposed by Japan's geography and political policies meant that technological innovations, medical discoveries, and social developments that were improving life in other parts of the world took centuries to reach Japanese communities, if they arrived at all, leaving populations vulnerable to diseases that had been conquered elsewhere, and forcing them to struggle with problems that had long since been solved by more advanced civilizations. Personal privacy was not just rare, but actively discouraged as a form of antisocial behavior, with individuals who sought solitude or tried to keep their activities secret being viewed with suspicion and hostility by neighbors who were encouraged to report unusual behavior to local authorities, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance where every action, conversation, and even private thought was subject to scrutiny and potential punishment. The economic system provided no mechanism for social mobility or improvement in living conditions, with people being locked into their social positions from birth and having no opportunity to escape poverty, oppression, or dangerous working conditions through education, entrepreneurship, or other forms of self-advancement that we consider fundamental rights in the modern world. Transportation networks were so primitive and dangerous that most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace during their entire lives, living and dying in the same small communities where their ancestors had struggled for generations, with no knowledge of the wider world, no understanding of different ways of life, and no hope that conditions might be better in other places. The legal system made no provision for appeals, second opinions, or review of judicial decisions, with local magistrates having absolute authority to impose whatever punishments they deemed appropriate, regardless of how arbitrary, cruel, or disproportionate these penalties might be. And once sentence was pronounced, it was carried out immediately without any possibility of intervention or reconsideration. Medical treatment was not only ineffective but often actively harmful, with physicians relying on superstitious beliefs, folk remedies, and brutal procedures that frequently killed patients who might have recovered if left untreated, while the complete absence of anesthesia, antiseptics, and surgical knowledge made even minor medical interventions excruciatingly painful and potentially fatal experiences. The climate extremes could be deadly for people whose clothing, housing, and heating systems were inadequate to protect them from severe weather conditions, with hypothermia claiming thousands of lives during harsh winters, while heat stroke and dehydration killed equally large numbers during sweltering summers. And the primitive construction techniques used in building homes provided minimal insulation or weather protection. Food safety was a constant concern in a world where there was no understanding of bacterial contamination, proper food storage techniques, or the importance of cooking temperatures in preventing foodborne illnesses, with entire families regularly falling victim to food poisoning that could cause weeks of agony followed by death from dehydration, organ failure, or secondary infections. Social customs required such elaborate and time-consuming displays of respect and deference that significant portions of each day were devoted to ritualistic behavior that served no practical purpose beyond reinforcing the rigid hierarchy that kept the powerful in control and the weak in submission, with these ceremonies being mandatory rather than optional and failure to perform them correctly resulting in severe social and legal consequences. The disposal of garbage and waste created serious health hazards for entire communities, with rotting organic matter attracting disease-carrying vermin, contaminating water supplies, and creating breeding grounds for flies, mosquitoes, and other insects that spread deadly pathogens throughout the population. While the complete absence of organized waste management systems meant that these problems grew worse over time rather than being addressed through systematic solutions. Personal safety was threatened not just by human criminals and wild animals, but also by the constant possibility of accidents involving fire, sharp tools, unstable structures, and other hazards that were unavoidable parts of daily life in a world where safety precautions were unknown and protective equipment was non-existent, making serious injury or death a daily possibility for everyone regardless of their age, gender, or social status. The educational system, where it existed at all, was designed to suppress critical thinking and independent analysis in favor of rote memorization and unquestioning acceptance of traditional beliefs, with students being punished severely for asking questions, expressing doubts, or suggesting alternative approaches to solving problems, creating populations of intellectually stunted individuals who were incapable of innovation or adaptation. Religious persecution was common and severe, with individuals who failed to conform to orthodox beliefs and practices being subjected to torture, exile, or execution, while even minor deviations from approved religious behavior could result in accusations of heresy that carried death sentences, creating an atmosphere of fear and conformity that stifled spiritual growth and personal development. The political system offered no mechanism for peaceful change or reform, with dissent being crushed through violence and oppression rather than addressed through dialogue or compromise. And the concentration of power in the hands of a small elite meant that the needs and interests of ordinary citizens were ignored or actively opposed by rulers who viewed their subjects as sources of labor and tribute, rather than as human beings deserving of respect and consideration. Marriage and family relationships were governed by economic considerations rather than emotional bonds, with parents arranging unions based on financial advantage rather than compatibility or affection. While divorce was virtually impossible and domestic abuse was not only tolerated, but sometimes encouraged as a way of maintaining proper household discipline and social order. The working conditions in various trades and occupations were so hazardous and unhealthy that most workers suffered from chronic pain, respiratory problems, repetitive stress injuries, and exposure to toxic materials that gradually poisoned their bodies over years or decades of labor. While the complete absence of workers' rights or safety regulations meant that employers could exploit their workers without fear of legal consequences or public criticism. Waterborne diseases spread rapidly through communities that relied on contaminated wells, streams, and rivers for their drinking water, with cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, and other deadly illnesses regularly claiming hundreds or thousands of lives during epidemic outbreaks that could devastate entire regions within a matter of weeks. While the lack of medical knowledge meant that these diseases were often attributed to supernatural causes rather than poor sanitation, the seasonal availability of food created boom and bust cycles that could swing from relative abundance during good harvest years to near starvation during periods of crop failure, natural disaster, or military conflict, with no government programs, charitable organizations, or other safety nets to help communities survive these recurring crises that tested the limits of human endurance and frequently exceeded them. Personal possessions were so few and precious that the loss of even a single tool, piece of clothing, or household item could create serious hardship for entire families, while the primitive manufacturing techniques and limited trade networks meant that replacing broken or worn-out items was often impossible, forcing people to make do with inadequate equipment that made their already difficult lives even more challenging and dangerous. The justice system included punishments specifically designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation rather than to rehabilitate criminals or protect society, with public torture and execution being viewed as acceptable forms of entertainment that served to reinforce social hierarchies and deter potential lawbreakers through the spectacle of extreme suffering that awaited those who violated the established order. Natural lighting was the only option available after sunset, creating long periods of darkness that limited productive activities, made travel extremely dangerous, and contributed to accidents and injuries that occurred when people tried to work or move around in insufficient light, while the expense of candles and oil lamps meant that most families spent their evenings in complete darkness, going to bed shortly after sunset, regardless of their personal preferences or social needs. The concept of individual rights and personal freedom was not just absent, but actively opposed by authorities who viewed such ideas as threats to social stability and their own power, with any expression of independence or nonconformity being met with swift and often brutal punishment designed to discourage similar behavior in others and maintain the rigid control that kept society functioning according to the wishes of its rulers. Thus, as you stood there in that alien world of feudal Japan, surrounded by the overwhelming stench of human waste and rotting food, listening to sounds you couldn't understand from people whose customs were completely foreign to everything you had ever known, feeling the rough homespun clothing chafing against your soft modern skin, while your stomach cramped from the contaminated water you had been forced to drink, watching the suspicious and hostile faces of people who saw you as a dangerous outsider who threatened their precarious existence, and realizing that every breath you took, every step you made, every word you spoke could easily be your last in a world where death lurked around every corner, and mercy was a luxury that few could afford to show, you would finally understand that the romantic notions of honor, beauty, and exotic adventure that had drawn you to this place were nothing more than fantasies created by people who had never experienced the grinding poverty, constant terror, and brutal realities of life in an age when human existence was truly nasty, brutish, and short, and your last coherent thought before succumbing to the dysentery, exposure, violence, or simple despair that would inevitably claim your life would be the bitter recognition that you had traveled through time not to discover a noble and fascinating culture, but to experience firsthand what it truly meant to live without the countless protections, comforts, and freedoms that you had foolishly taken for granted in your own era, and that no amount of historical knowledge or cultural sensitivity could have prepared you for the simple, overwhelming truth that you wouldn't have lasted even a single day in the harsh and unforgiving world of feudal Japan.